If you go to the archives in Lincoln, among the records of the bishops of Lincoln are a series of ancient volumes containing the proceedings of a body called a consistory court. This was a special court that medieval bishops used to deal with problems arising in churches and parishes in their care. As you might imagine, the books are rather large and very full, and make for interesting reading if you enjoy reading about scandals. And who doesn't like a good medieval scandal? One of the volumes dates from the early years of the 15th century. It is a book bound in parchment, and it contains the proceedings of the court from the time when a man called Philip Repington was the Bishop of Lincoln. 5 pages in this volume are labelled in a very bold hand, somewhat ominously, De Tribulationibus Thedlethorpe Omnium Sanctorum, concerning the tribulations, the troubles at Thedlethorpe All Saints. This account relates to an awful business that took place in Thedlethorpe in a remote part of the Lincolnshire Marsh in 1424. The whole sorry affair only involved 2 families, but it shocked the village for many years, and it was still remembered a century ago, though the place is sparsely populated now, and the tale has fallen out of the public consciousness. On the one hand was a family called the De Hayntons, who had owned a small manor here since the late 12th century. The other family were the Salters, and as their name suggested, they were a family of salt merchants who had become very rich very quickly through the development of salt works at nearby Skidbrook. Having done very well in trade, they became tenants of a parcel of land in Thedlethorpe sometime around 1370. The lands they rented were owned by the Cistercian Abbey of Reesby, and they adjoined the manor of the De Hayntons. In 1420, the head of the De Haynton family was the genial figure of Sir Robert De Haynton. He was a man in his 40s and a war veteran too, who had seen active service with Henry V at Agincourt. As a landowner and a master, he was well regarded by his estate workers, and he was a man of piety and integrity. He and his wife, Dame Alice, had only one child, Margaret, who in 1424 was only 10, and she was his heiress. The head of the Salter family was the 60-year-old John Salter, rather a bully of a man, who farmed the land and managed the salt workings with his 2 sons, William and John, both of whom feared him greatly. In the early 14th century, the De Hayntons, as one of the major families in the village, had started to bury their loved ones at the head of the south aisle of the church in a screened-off chapel. It was to be their chantry chapel, a place where they could be buried and where masses could be celebrated for their souls. When Sir Robert De Haynton died rather suddenly in February of 1424, he was quite naturally buried in this family chapel, with his parents and his grandparents right in front of the altar, under a wonderful gravestone that he had imported from London and laid down before his death, on which he was shown in brass, dressed in full armour, his hands clasped in prayer, and with a lion of chivalry at his feet. Sadly, John Salter saw his genial neighbour's death as an opportunity to prosper at the Hayntons' expense, and within days of Sir Robert's death he began to encroach on the Hayntons' lands, making life very difficult for the widow Dame Alice and their young daughter Margaret. He used all sorts of unpleasant tactics and intimidation to get the upper hand in their time of grief. The Consistory Court records inform us that within a few months of Sir Robert De Haynton's death, things take a somewhat sinister turn. In autumn of 1424, John Salter ails and sickens, and on his deathbed he makes a horrible and macabre request of his eldest son William. As well as having his eyes on the De Haynton lands, it seems that John Salter had his eye on the De Haynton Chapel in All Saints' Church too, and he requests that once he is dead, his remains are buried there and displace those of the brave soldier Sir Robert. On the 12th of October 1424, John Salter dies, It isn't, of course, possible to bury him directly in the de Hainton Chapel, and he is buried the next day where the parson directs, just inside the south porch of All Saints' Church. However, William, who fears his father's power even after his death, feels duty-bound to fulfil his father's macabre wishes. So in the middle of the night on the 15th of October 1424, having bribed the aged parish sexton to assist him, they both go with lanterns to All Saints' Church. They carefully lift the memorial stone of Sir Robert de Hainton and remove his body from its grave. Then they lift the newly buried body of John Salter from his burial place in the porch. William and the aged clerk move Sir Robert's body between them, but he'd been a career soldier and was a large and fit man in life, and it was a hard task. They were unable to lift him, so they dragged the corpse of this once dignified man by the knot at the top of his shroud the full length of the church, and without any dignity roughly deposited him in the grave in the porch before filling it in. Then they pick up the slighter figure of the dead and shrouded John Salter and more carefully bury him beneath Sir Robert's gravestone. All is carefully put back. Both Dame Alice and little Margaret still come to the grave as Sir Robert de Hainton to say their prayers for his soul, none the wiser that under the gravestone is the body of the rogue John Salter. The aged parish sexton was badly affected by his involvement in this terrible affair and his clear dereliction of duties, and he finds it increasingly difficult to work in the church. Every time he enters the church and walks over the grave of Sir Robert, now in the porch, he remembers how he and John Salter roughly treated him, and each time he is confronted by the recognisable stench of death that, despite swinging the thurible with incense as he assists at the Mass, simply lingers in his nostrils. Every time he has to go and light the tapers before the image of the Virgin Mary beside the high altar, he sees in the corbel head supporting her the face of Sir Robert de Hainton. It was not much easier for William Salter either. As he stood in church at Mass, he would look up at the Last Judgment scene over the rood screen, and he would see terrible things. There above the arch was the image of Christ seated on a rainbow judging all the world, and below at Christ's feet were the figures of the dead in their shrouds rising from their graves, and every single one of those shrouded figures appeared to him to be Sir Robert de Hainton. To the left of Christ was St. Peter welcoming the saved into heaven, and each of the saved had Hainton's face too. While on the right was the great devouring mouth, a mouth of hell, with devils taking away the souls of the damned, and every figure of the damned had either his own face or that of his late father. Often as he was standing in church, he would see out of the corner of his eye, through the door in the chapel screen, a figure in armour, standing on top of what was now the grave of his father in the Hainton Chapel. It couldn't be his father, who had never worn a suit of armour in his life, and he was certain it was the ghost of Sir Robert de Hainton, but he dare not turn his head unless he came face to face with him. William couldn't rest at night either. Each night as he settled down in his chamber, he heard below his window the distinctive sound of a spade digging through rough clay as though opening a grave, followed by what sounded like the efforts of two men attempting to lift and then dragging a heavy corpse towards it. When William opened the shutters to look outside, there was complete silence and nothing to be seen. The sexton was the first to break his silence, and unable to bear the weight of his actions any longer, he confessed to the parish priest. Both he and William Salter were summoned before the Bishop's Consistory Court to answer for their behaviour, and they received the full censure of the court. Until they made amends and public penance, they were excommunicated. They were ordered by the court, at pains of incarceration in the Bishop's prison at Newark, to exhume once again with care the remains of William's father and Sir Robert de Hainton, and rebury Sir Robert where he belonged, in the Hainton Chapel, and John Salter back in the porch. After these terrible experiences of his youth in Thedlethorpe, William gave over the tenancy to his younger brother John, who in time married Margaret, the daughter and heiress of Sir Robert de Hainton, and the two estates were amalgamated without any need for foul play and subterfuge, and the chapel became in time the Salter Chapel. William became a monk at the recently founded Carthusian monastery on the Isle of Axholme, where he died in the 1460s, having spent the rest of his days praying for his father's soul and that of Sir Robert de Hainton. Is there anything left at All Saints in Thedlethorpe that provides evidence to back up this terrible story recorded in the records? Well, yes, there is. The Hainton Chapel, now the Salter Chapel, still remains. It is surrounded by a 16th century screen with a heraldry upon it, some recording the marriage of a later Salter to a daughter of the Hilton family of North Yorkshire. And the gravestone of Sir Robert de Hainton is still to be seen, set into the floor of the chapel, his brass still clear, with his feet upon the lion. Close by can be seen the indent of the brass of his daughter Margaret and her husband John Salter. Sadly, the Last Judgment scene that poor William Salter was haunted by has gone, for although remains of medieval war paintings were found above the chancel arch in the 1850s, they were obliterated when the plaster was removed at the Victorian Restoration 40 years later. Thankfully, the rood screen below does still remain. In the chancel is the corbel that once supported the image of the Virgin Mary that turned into the face of Bishop Reppington when the sexton looked at it. It's an ugly thing, but I have never seen it transform in likeness. Such events do, of course, leave a mark on a place. All Saints is in a very remote spot, and to the day locals still have a tendency to hurry by. It was often said by people in Thedlethorpe in the 19th century that during the month of October, if you passed by the church after midnight, you might well see the flickering light of lanterns from the windows, and if you listened carefully, you may hear the noise of a thumping spade on clay, and a distinctive sound like a heavy sack being dragged through the church. I do hope you enjoyed that story as much as I have enjoyed writing it. May I take this opportunity to thank you all for your support over the last year, and to wish you and your families a very happy Christmas and a blessed and a peaceful new year. Bye for now.